The Melungeons were never who America said they were. DNA uncovered a secret buried for 200 years. High on a windswept spine of rock in East Tennessee, there's a ridge most maps barely bother to name. Newman's Ridge. For the better part of 200 years, the families who lived up there were a puzzle nobody could solve. And, if we're honest, a puzzle a lot of people didn't want solved. Their neighbors down in the valleys had a name for them. Melungeons. Nobody could agree on where the word came from, or where the people came from, or why their skin was a shade darker than the settlers around them. What everyone agreed on was simpler and crueler. These people were different, and different in the American South was dangerous. So, the stories started. Some said the Melungeons were the last of a lost Portuguese crew, shipwrecked and stranded in the mountains. Others, Turkish sailors abandoned by Sir Francis Drake, Phoenicians, ancient Israelites, survivors of the lost colony of Roanoke. Take your pick. For 2 centuries, the Melungeons were whoever the storyteller needed them to be. And here's the strange part. The Melungeons often believed the stories too. Being Portuguese was respectable. It meant you were white, or close enough. In a world where the wrong answer could cost you your land, your vote, your children, a shipwreck story was armor. But armor isn't the same thing as the truth. In 2012, a team of genetic genealogists did what generations of rumor never could. They tested the DNA, and what came back didn't match a single one of the legends. It rewrote the whole story, and it made a lot of people very angry. To understand why, you have to go back before the ridge, back before the name. Let's start with the word itself, because even that is a fight. Melungeon. The most convincing explanation is that it comes from the French word mélange, meaning a mixture, a blend, which turned out to be the most accurate description anyone ever gave them, long before anyone knew why. The Melungeon families settled where Tennessee, Virginia, Kentucky, and North Carolina fold together. The hollows and ridges around the Cumberland Gap, Hancock County, Vardy Valley, places that were hard to reach on purpose. Up there, tucked into the folds of the mountains, a family could be left alone, and being left alone mattered. Because down in the settled world, the paperwork was closing in. Think about the early 1800s South. Your legal race wasn't a box on a form, it was everything. Whether you owned property, whether you testified in court, whether you married who you loved, whether your children were free, and the Melungeons lived on the knife's edge of that system, too dark to be simply white in their neighbors' eyes, but not enslaved, not anything the law had a tidy category for. So, they got squeezed. Census takers wrote down whatever they felt like. Free person of color, 1 decade. White the next, depending on who held the pen. Families were pushed off land, denied the vote, and the Melungeons learned a lesson, passed down like a family heirloom. Don't talk about it. Say you're Portuguese. Say you're Black Dutch. Say anything but the truth, because the truth had never once worked in your favor. Then it got worse. In 1924, Virginia passed the Racial Integrity Act. On paper, a marriage law. In practice, one of the most aggressive attempts at racial classification in American history. It enforced the one-drop rule, a single drop of African ancestry, and you were legally black, no matter how you looked or lived. And it had an enforcer, Walter Plecker, who ran Virginia's Bureau of Vital Statistics with the zeal of a man on a mission. Plecker was obsessed with the Melungeons. He was convinced they were African-descended families slipping across the color line. and he made it his personal crusade to stop them. In 1943, he sent lists to county clerks, actual lists of surnames, flagging families to be reclassified. Marriage records altered, birth certificates changed, ancestries erased with the stroke of a bureaucrat's pen. Imagine that. A government official deciding, by fiat, who your grandparents were allowed to have been. So, is it any wonder the Melungeons clung to the shipwreck stories, when the alternative was Walter Plecker's list? We're descended from Portuguese sailors wasn't a myth. It was survival. For decades, that's where it sat. A mystery wrapped in fear, guarded by silence, decorated with legends. Historians argued, novelists romanticized, families whispered. Nobody actually knew, until the science caught up. By the 2000s, DNA testing crossed a threshold. You didn't need a document to trace a bloodline. The bloodline was the document. Researcher Roberta Estes, working with Jack Goins and a small team, decided to do something nobody had managed. Not to guess about the Melungeons, to test them. This wasn't casual. Goins himself descended from core Melungeon families, his own history on the line. The team spent years hunting descendants of the oldest lines, families whose names had shown up on those persecution lists a century earlier. Then they looked at two specific things: the Y chromosome, tracing the direct paternal line back through centuries, and mitochondrial DNA, tracing the direct maternal line. Two threads. Follow both, and you don't get a legend. You get an answer. They published it in 2012. The answer landed like a thunderclap. The paternal lines, the father's father's fathers, were overwhelmingly sub-Saharan African. The maternal lines, the mother's mother's mothers, were overwhelmingly European. White women, in plain terms, not Portuguese, not Turkish, not a lost tribe of anybody. The Melungeons were, at their origin, the children of African men and European women. That French word, mélange, a mixture, was the literal truth the whole time. But the when and where make this story extraordinary. They trace the origins to Colonial Virginia, the middle of the 1600s, and here is the detail everyone misses. In those first decades, the rigid racial world we think of didn't fully exist yet. Africans and Europeans arrived together at the bottom of the same brutal ladder, working the same fields, sharing the same quarters, and sometimes they had children. There's a real family at the root, a man named John Gowen, one of the first Africans documented in Virginia, and a woman named Margaret Cornish. Their descendants are woven directly into the Melungeon story. These weren't ghosts from a myth. They were real people who lived and loved on the wrong side of a line that hadn't quite finished being drawn. Then, the line came down. Hard. Colonial Virginia slammed its laws into place, and families of mixed ancestry had two choices: sink to the bottom of a merciless system, or disappear. So they moved, out of the tidewater, up into the mountains, into the hollows where the law had a harder time following. And there, marrying among themselves, they became a people the outside world couldn't classify. They became the Melungeons. The shipwreck was never real. The truth was better, and heavier. They were the living memory of a moment in early America when the walls hadn't gone up yet. A moment the history books mostly forgot on purpose. When the results came out, plenty of descendants were thrilled to finally have an answer, but others were furious. Roberta Estes said it plainly. There were a lot of people upset by the study. They just knew they were Portuguese. Some had built their whole identity on the legend. and the DNA took it away. And you can understand it. For 200 years, the shipwreck had been the shield. It kept families safe from a line that could ruin them. To be told the shield was never true was a kind of grief. Even when the truth set them free, it still took something. But maybe that's the real lesson. For generations, an entire people were taught the truth about their blood was something to hide, something to bury under a prettier lie. And it took a strand of DNA, immune to Plecker's lists, older than every law written to divide them, to say what no document dared. There was never anything to be ashamed of. The Melungeons were never the mystery. We were. The mystery was always why a country would rather invent a shipwreck than admit what its own beginnings actually looked like. The ridge is still there. The families are still there. Many proud now in a way their great-grandparents never could have been out loud. And the answer they searched for across 2 centuries turned out to be sitting inside them the whole time, waiting for the science and the courage to finally read it. If this story moved you, if somewhere in your family there's a legend nobody can quite explain, sit with that for a second. The Melungeons are proof of something worth remembering. Sometimes, the truth we're most afraid of turns out to be the one that finally sets us free.